It was a Friday morning in early June when Evelyn Monroe last saw her husband and daughter. The sky above Cannon Beach, Oregon, was soft with clouds, the kind that drifted slowly like they had nowhere to be. The house smelled of coffee and sea salt, and somewhere down the hallway, the dryer hummed with the last of Lily's towels. Evelyn stood barefoot in the kitchen, her robe tied loosely, as she watched David zip the cooler shut. "Did you pack the oranges?" she asked, already knowing the answer. David gave his usual quiet nod, that half-smile barely reaching his eyes. "And the trail mix," he said, hoisting the bag over one shoulder. 13-year-old Lily bounded in, hoodie half-zipped over her bathing suit, long hair braided and damp from her morning shower. She grinned at Evelyn and grabbed the sunscreen from the counter, stuffing it into her backpack without a word. They were going to Devil's Cove. Just the two of them. A weekend getaway. A tradition, David called it. A way to bond, he said, father and daughter time. Evelyn didn't argue. She was happy they had found their rhythm, that the quiet man she married had become someone Lily could trust. That morning, Evelyn kissed her daughter on the forehead and told David to check in before dark. He promised they'd be back Sunday evening. They didn't come back. At first, Evelyn wasn't worried. David often took the longer route up the coast, and cell service could be spotty near the cliffs. She told herself they were watching the sunset, maybe roasting marshmallows over a small beach fire, like they did last summer. But by Sunday night, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the driveway remained empty, her chest tightened in a way she couldn't ignore. She reheated the soup she made that morning, left it on the stove, untouched, called David's phone. Straight to voicemail. Tried Lily's. No answer. By 4 a.m. Monday, she called the sheriff's office. Her voice was calm, too calm. "My husband and daughter went camping. They were supposed to be home last night. They're not back." At 6:42 a.m., a local fisherman radioed in a report of an empty kayak drifting near Haystack Rock. The Coast Guard dispatched a vessel immediately. The identification was confirmed by 7:18. Evelyn's heart stopped when they said the registration matched David's. The boat was intact. No signs of struggle. No damage. The paddles were secured. The life jackets were missing. Inside the kayak was a small dry bag. Sandwiches wrapped neatly. A bottle of sunscreen. Lily's water bottle with her name in Sharpie. David's pocket knife. A damp towel. But no one was there. No blood. No signs of distress. No radio call. No flare. Just absence. The Coast Guard launched a full-scale search. Helicopters circled the coastline. Dive teams scoured the reefs. Dogs were brought in. Sonar was dragged along the seafloor. For 11 days, the waters around Cannon Beach were combed like a crime scene. Nothing. Not a shoe. Not a piece of fabric. Not a single trace of the people Evelyn had kissed goodbye. News trucks parked at the end of the block. Neighbors left flowers. Reporters asked if David was an experienced sailor. He was. Asked if Lily could swim. She could. Evelyn stood on her porch every night, wrapped in the same cardigan David gave her their first Christmas together. The porch light stayed on. The front door stayed unlocked. Hope lingered like the smell of salt in the air. Then, quietly, the search ended. The Coast Guard listed them as presumed lost at sea, a phrase that sounded too clean, too polite. It didn't account for the unanswered questions, the undisturbed boat, the uneaten sandwiches, the silence that screamed louder than any siren. No bodies, no funeral, no goodbye, just a woman left alone in a house where the voices had vanished. Evelyn didn't cry right away, not in front of the officers, not during the interviews. Grief didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in like fog, thick, slow, suffocating. She filed the missing persons reports herself, gave them dental records, photos, descriptions of Lily's birthmark, signed papers with a hand that barely trembled. Inside, she was unraveling, because something was wrong. She knew the ocean could be cruel, but this wasn't chaos. It was calm. It was too clean. She didn't say it aloud. Not yet. But deep in her gut, Evelyn didn't believe her family had been taken by the sea. She believed they had left her. And that was a different kind of death altogether. David Monroe wasn't the kind of man who made a grand entrance. He wasn't loud, flashy, or the center of any room. He was the type you noticed slowly. A quiet presence that grew on you, like the tide creeping over the sand. He had a calm, collected way of being that made you feel safe, even when you didn't know why. Evelyn met him on a rainy Thursday evening at a church book club in Astoria, Oregon. She had only started attending a few weeks earlier, needing something to fill the long, quiet hours after dinner. She was still grieving then, still folding her late husband's shirts even though she hadn't touched his side of the bed in months. David came late that night, walked in without fanfare, wore a simple navy jacket, jeans, and a face that looked like it had weathered more storms than he would ever admit out loud. He sat in the back and didn't speak the entire session. When the group ended and people began packing up their books, he stayed behind and helped fold the chairs without being asked. That's how it started. Not with sparks, not with butterflies, but with quiet. He introduced himself as a retired naval engineer who'd moved to the coast for the air. Said he liked boats and the quiet. Evelyn had smiled politely, thanked him for the help, and went home thinking she'd never see him again. But he came back the next week, sat in the same seat, said just enough to be polite, but never more than needed. Over the next few months, they began talking after the meetings. Just small things at first. Weather, books, memories of places they had visited. Evelyn noticed how David always listened more than he talked, how he never interrupted, how he paused before answering, like he was choosing his words carefully. He wasn't charming in the traditional sense. He didn't flirt, didn't compliment her hair or her dress. But he remembered things, asked about the lilies in her garden, brought her a paperback once because it reminded him of something she'd said. He never overstepped, never assumed. That kind of gentleness was rare. And for a woman who had lost more than most, that gentleness felt like peace. David had moved into a small cabin near the marina a few years before they met. He worked part-time repairing boat engines. People at the dock said he was reliable, always on time, always fair. The kind of man who would fix a leak without charging you if it only took him 10 minutes. He wasn't social, but he wasn't rude either. Just quiet, reserved. Evelyn found that comforting. When he met her daughter Lily, he didn't try to impress her. He didn't bribe her with gifts or force conversation. He just showed up, drove her to school when Evelyn was sick, fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door without saying a word, let her talk when she wanted to, and gave her space when she didn't. At the time, it felt like everything Evelyn had prayed for. Lily had been distant since her father died, guarded, too grown for her age in all the wrong ways. She didn't laugh the way she used to, didn't run toward Evelyn after school like she once did. But with David, she seemed steadier. Not joyful, not open, but less brittle. One afternoon, after a long walk along the boardwalk, Lily told Evelyn, "He doesn't try too hard. That's why I like him." Evelyn held on to that sentence like a lifeline. When David proposed, it wasn't dramatic. He didn't get down on one knee or take her to a fancy dinner. They were in the kitchen, doing dishes. He dried his hands on a towel, looked over at her, and said, "I'd like to grow old with you, Evelyn. No rush. Just if you want to." She said yes without thinking. Because by then, he wasn't just the man she talked to after church. He was the one who checked the locks before bed, who remembered to pick up Lily's favorite cereal, who left handwritten notes. The first time Evelyn met David Monroe, it was a quiet Sunday morning at Harbor Grace Community Church. The air smelled like old hymnals and fresh donuts, and the sanctuary was only half full. He sat 2 pews ahead of her, alone, with his hands folded and his back straight, wearing a worn navy windbreaker and faded jeans. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just stillness. At the time, Evelyn wasn't looking for anything. She was still finding her footing, 2 years after her first husband's sudden passing. There were days when the loneliness felt like a thick coat she couldn't take off. But she had Lily, who was 10 then, and teaching kept her busy enough to keep the ache at a low simmer. After the service, David held the door open for her and said, "Good sermon." That was it. No small talk, no awkward charm, just a simple comment in a voice that was steady and low. Over the next few weeks, he kept appearing, sometimes before her in the coffee line, sometimes at the community garden on Saturdays. He always nodded when he saw her, always said hello, but he never lingered. It wasn't until the church organized a volunteer weekend repairing boats for low-income families that Evelyn finally got more than a sentence out of him. David had grease on his hands and sweat on his brow, bent over an old fishing skiff with the kind of focus most people reserved for surgery. She handed him a bottle of water. He looked up, smiled just a little, and said thank you. And then, for the first time, he asked a question. "How long have you been coming here?" They talked for maybe 15 minutes. About the church. About her work as an elementary school counselor. About his job fixing marine engines at the harbor. She learned that he'd served in the Navy for over 20 years. Retired early. No kids. Lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. Evelyn nodded, quietly recognizing that kind of grief. They started having coffee after church. Sometimes just the two of them. Sometimes with Lily tagging along. He didn't ask a lot of questions, but he always listened. Really listened. He had a way of making silence feel safe instead of awkward. Lily wasn't sure what to make of him at first. She was shy around men, even more so since losing her dad. But David never pushed. He treated her with kindness, but gave her space. And that meant something. What stood out about David wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try too hard. He didn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. And in a world where men often tried to take up space with noise, David was different. He made space for others. By the time winter rolled around, Evelyn found herself reaching for her phone in the evenings, wondering if he might call. She caught herself smiling at the sound of his truck pulling into the church parking lot. She noticed how safe she felt when he was around. Like the air changed. They didn't have a grand courtship. There were no roses or poems or big declarations. Just consistency. He showed up when he said he would. Helped fix the leaky faucet without being asked. Brought her chicken noodle soup when Lily caught the flu. It wasn't fireworks. It was warmth. And after everything she'd been through, warmth felt like a miracle. They married in the spring of 2005. A small ceremony behind the church with folding chairs and lavender in mason jars. Lily wore a pale blue dress with white sandals. She didn't cry. She didn't smile much either. But when David held the Bible during the vows, she stood beside her mother without flinching. Evelyn knew it wouldn't be easy. Blending a family never is. But she believed they could build something steady. Something good. For a while, they did. David was patient, predictable, gentle. He never tried to replace Lily's father. He didn't ask her to call him anything. But slowly, she warmed to him. They started going on small weekend outings. Fishing, hiking, renting canoes on quiet lakes. Evelyn stayed home most times, using the opportunity to grade papers or tend to the garden. One Sunday, a few months after the wedding, Lily came home carrying a small wooden box she and David had made together. She didn't say much, just placed it on the shelf beside her books. Later that evening, she called him Dad for the first time. Softly, casually, like it had always been there. Evelyn felt her heart swell. This was what healing looked like. She believed it with everything in her. David became part of their rhythm. He made Lily's school lunches, took her to dentist appointments when Evelyn had work, drove her to swim practice. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, never missed a birthday. He was solid, grounded, the kind of man you trusted to remember to check the oil and lock the back door. He wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but he left sticky notes on the fridge that said things like, "Don't forget your umbrella," or "You looked peaceful when you slept." And in the quiet, Evelyn let herself believe she had found peace again. Not the young kind of love, not the firework kind, but the kind that lets you exhale after years of holding your breath. Friends envied her, said she was lucky to have found someone so steady. Evelyn would nod, modestly, not wanting to boast, but inwardly grateful. If there were cracks, she didn't see them. If there were signs, she didn't look closely enough. Because David had earned her trust the old-fashioned way, with time and patience. And trust, once given, can be a dangerous thing to unlearn. Looking back, Evelyn would revisit those early days again and again in her mind. Every glance, every silence, every quiet Sunday morning. She'd remember how David never talked much about his time in the Navy. How he once said, "Some things you leave behind on purpose." She thought it meant pain, maybe regret. She never imagined it meant secrets. Years later, Evelyn would sit on the edge of a motel bed in a country far from home and try to recall the exact moment when everything shifted. When silence stopped meaning safety. When love became something else. But she'd always come back to that first day. That simple nod. That quiet man. The one she thought had saved her. The one she never really knew. At first, it was the little things. David would pick Lily up from school when Evelyn had meetings. He'd drive her to swim practice, wait in the car with a book, and always have a snack ready afterward. He was the one who showed her how to change a flat tire on her bike, how to tie proper knots for camping trips, how to read a tide chart like second nature. He didn't try to win her over with big gestures. He didn't shower her with praise or push for affection. He just showed up, again and again, quietly, consistently. And for a girl whose father had died too young, that consistency was comforting. At 12, Lily was still forming who she wanted to be. She was smart, but guarded, creative, but cautious. She didn't open up easily, especially not to men. But with David, something shifted. Slowly, naturally, the way flowers turn toward light without even realizing it. By the time her 13th birthday came around, she didn't flinch when David sat next to her at the dinner table. She didn't hesitate to laugh at his dry jokes or ask for help on her math homework. And one night, without ceremony, she handed him a Father's Day card she had made at school. It was simple, a hand-drawn boat, 2 figures on the deck. The words, "Thanks for keeping me steady." Evelyn found it tucked on David's dresser weeks later, carefully pressed beneath his old Navy medals. Their bond deepened over shared routines. Saturday mornings became theirs. They'd wake early, pack up the cooler, and drive down to the marina. David had a small skiff he rented during the summers, nothing fancy. But to Lily, it was a world of its own. Open water, wind in her hair, freedom. Evelyn stayed home most of those days. She trusted them, trusted him. She would make pancakes, fold laundry, maybe call her sister while they were gone. Sometimes she'd sit on the back porch, watching the seagulls wheel over the rooftops, and feel a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. It felt like her family had finally become whole again. David was patient with Lily. He didn't criticize. He didn't demand. He taught by doing. When she made mistakes on the boat, he showed her how to correct them without making her feel small. When she got frustrated, he let her be. When she succeeded, he nodded quietly, letting the pride sit between them instead of turning it into a performance. Lily started changing in subtle ways. She grew quieter, not withdrawn, just more focused, more watchful. She stopped going to sleepovers, saying the noise gave her a headache. She declined birthday parties. She spent hours in her room sketching ocean creatures, her textbooks marked with tiny sticky notes. Evelyn chalked it up to adolescence. Lily was growing up, forming her identity, pulling inward the way teenage girls often do when the world starts pressing in. But there were moments that gave her pause. Like the night she found Lily's journal while cleaning. It was tucked between 2 cookbooks on the shelf in her room. No lock, no name, just a blue cover with frayed corners. Evelyn opened it, just for a second. She told herself it wasn't snooping. She only wanted to be sure her daughter was okay. The first line on the first page stopped her cold. "The ocean listens better than people." That was all she read. One sentence. She closed the journal, slid it back where she found it, and walked downstairs feeling like she had stepped into water too deep for her legs. That evening, she mentioned it to David over dinner. Her voice was casual, light. "Lily wrote something strange in her notebook," she said. "Said the ocean listens better than people." David didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his plate. "She's sensitive," he said. "The water calms her. It's probably better than scrolling on her phone all day like the other kids." Evelyn nodded. That made sense. And David always made sense. Still, the line stayed with her. She told herself not to worry. Lily was doing well in school. Her teachers said she was focused, respectful, mature. One even said she was the kind of student who sees everything, even when she pretends not to. Evelyn took pride in that. Maybe she was raising a strong girl. Maybe David's steady hand had helped build something solid. But the quiet grew louder. Lily started locking her door at night. She stayed up later. She took longer showers. Her questions grew fewer. Her gaze, more distant. When Evelyn suggested tagging along on a Sunday sailing trip, Lily quickly declined. "I've got homework," she said, eyes flicking toward David. He smiled and said, "Let her be. This is our thing." Evelyn didn't argue. She wanted to believe that a man who had stepped into their lives with such gentleness could never be anything but good. She wanted to believe that Lily had simply grown into a girl who needed space, not someone drifting towards something more dangerous. Sometimes, the most dangerous things don't scream. They whisper. They take their time. And they were the face of someone you've learned to trust. For Evelyn, the truth hadn't come yet. But the ripples were already there. She just hadn't learned how to see them. Not yet. It was early, just after 6 on a Friday morning in June. The kind of morning where the fog hugs the road and the birds haven't quite found their voices. Evelyn stood at the front door in her robe, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. David and Lily were loading the last of their gear into the back of the truck. He was calm, like always. Methodical, checking the cooler, the dry bags, the weather radio. Lily wore her favorite gray hoodie over a bathing suit. Her braid hung down her back, and she had her arms crossed like she was pretending to be annoyed by the early hour. But Evelyn could tell she was excited. These weekend sailing trips had become something of a ritual for the two of them. Out to Devil's Cove. 2 days. No cell service. Just the ocean, a boat, and quiet. Evelyn had packed them sandwiches the night before. She reminded David to wear sunscreen. Told Lily not to forget to hydrate. The usual things mothers say. The kinds of reminders that feel small but carry weight. David leaned in and gave her a half smile. We'll be back Sunday night. Lily stepped close, let Evelyn kiss her forehead, then turned away without a word. And just like that, they were gone. The truck rolled down the drive, turned left at the mailbox, and disappeared behind the trees. Evelyn stood there for a moment longer, listening to the sound of tires fading into distance. Then she went inside, rinsed her mug, started a load of laundry. She never imagined that would be the last time she saw either of them. The first few hours felt normal. She vacuumed the living room, trimmed the rosemary bush out back. She even opened a new book, one she'd been meaning to start for months. Saturday came and went. She thought about calling, but reminded herself there was no service out where they were headed. That was the point, after all. Disconnect. Reconnect with the water, with each other. But by Sunday evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to ash, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A quiet twitch in her chest. A low hum of unease. She reheated the casserole she'd made earlier. Set the table for 3. Poured water into 2 glasses. Just in case they came in hungry. 9 o'clock came. Then 10. No truck in the driveway. No phone call. No message. She called David's cell. Straight to voicemail. She called Lily's. No answer. Still, she waited. She told herself they'd just gotten delayed. Maybe they pulled into a dock for the night. Maybe they were stargazing somewhere, wrapped in towels, listening to waves lap the side of the boat. By 4:30 in the morning, Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. At 6, she called the Coast Guard. The woman on the other end of the line asked calm, practiced questions. What time did they leave? What were they wearing? What kind of boat? Did they have experience? Evelyn answered everything clearly. Precisely. Her voice never cracked. They've done this trip half a dozen times, she said. My husband's a strong sailor. My daughter wears her life jacket every single time. Every time. The Coast Guard took her information and promised to begin a search. At 6:42 a.m., a report came in from a fishing charter out near Haystack Rock. A kayak had been spotted adrift, unmanned. By 7:18, the registration was confirmed. It was David's boat. When they brought it in, the officers looked at Evelyn with the kind of sympathy that says more than words ever could. The boat was intact. Not a scratch. The engine still humming on idle. The cooler untouched. Inside, there were 2 sandwiches, 2 bottles of water, a jar of peanut butter, a single apple, neatly packed, unopened. Lily's purple flip-flops were tucked under the front seat. David's sunglasses rested on the dash. The emergency radio was fully functional. The life jackets were gone. No blood. No overturned items. No sign of a struggle. Nothing broken. Nothing forced. Just absence. And silence. Evelyn stood at the edge of the dock that afternoon, arms wrapped around her waist, watching the vessel that should have carried her family home. It looked like any other boat. Nothing about it screamed tragedy. But inside her, a storm had already begun. The official search began that afternoon. Helicopters, divers, patrol boats, dogs, drones, sonar equipment, the works. For 11 days, they combed the coastline. Nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a body. The local news ran the story under the headline, Father and Daughter Missing at Sea. Reporters knocked on Evelyn's door. She didn't answer. Neighbors brought casseroles and folded hands. Someone left flowers on the front step. The town held a candlelight vigil. A moment of silence. And then, slowly, the world moved on. But Evelyn didn't. Because none of it made sense. The boat wasn't damaged. The supplies weren't used. The emergency beacon hadn't been touched. There had been no distress call. No flare. No message. It was as if they had simply stepped off the edge of the earth. The Coast Guard eventually suspended the search. With no evidence of foul play and no bodies recovered, The case was closed. Presumed drowned. That was the phrase they used. But Evelyn didn't believe it. She sat in the living room long after the calls stopped coming. Long after the casseroles stopped arriving. Long after the porch light became less of a welcome and more of a monument. She stopped changing the sheets on their bed. Stopped moving his shoes from the door. Left Lily's bedroom exactly as it was. The books on her desk. The blanket folded on the edge of her bed. People told her to heal. To let go. To trust God's timing. But Evelyn couldn't. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right. The ocean was wild, yes, but not careless. She'd seen storms. Wreckage. Destruction. This wasn't that. This was clean. This was planned. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her bones. They hadn't been swallowed by the sea. They had vanished by choice. And for the next 15 years, Evelyn would carry that silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of abandonment. The kind of silence that doesn't mourn. It waits. Evelyn Monroe didn't hold a funeral. There were no hymns, no flowers, no slideshow of childhood photos. No line of mourners offering hugs that never quite reached the heart. There wasn't even a casket. How do you bury someone who might not be dead? After the Coast Guard called off the search, the paperwork started to arrive. Missing person reports. Statements to sign. Legal notices about the process of declaring a loved one deceased. All of it cold. All of it sterile. She filled out each form with careful handwriting, never rushing, as if neatness could somehow keep the pain in order. When the final document came in, presumed deceased, David Monroe and Lily and Monroe, lost at sea. Evelyn stared at it for hours before signing. The pen in her hand trembled once, then stilled. After that, everything changed. The front door stopped opening. The phone stopped ringing. The porch light stayed on, night after night, casting a soft glow over the empty driveway. Inside the house, time folded in on itself. David's boots stayed by the door. His toothbrush still sat in the cup beside the sink. His watch rested on the nightstand, battery dead but undisturbed. Lily's room remained untouched. Her purple backpack hanging from the hook. Her favorite sweatshirt draped over the desk chair. A sketch of a seahorse still half finished in her notebook. Evelyn didn't pack anything away. Not because she was clinging to hope, but because the idea of folding their clothes into boxes felt like betrayal. Like sealing up the last evidence they had ever lived there. She told herself it was temporary. That she'd clean the rooms eventually. That she just needed more time. But time did what it always does. It passed, whether she was ready or not. The days blurred. She went back to work at the elementary school after a few weeks. Her co-workers welcomed her with quiet eyes and soft voices. They meant well. But no one knew what to say to a woman whose family had vanished into thin air. So they said nothing at all. Evelyn would sit at her desk during lunch, staring at the tiny framed photo of Lily from the 4th grade. The one where she's grinning with a missing tooth and holding a science trophy like it was made of gold. She kept that photo facing her every day. A reminder of the sound of laughter. Of peanut butter sandwiches and tangled hair, and the way Lily used to hum under her breath when she did homework. At home, Evelyn moved through her routine like a ghost. She made coffee every morning. Set 2 extra plates on the table without realizing. Caught herself reaching for David's coat before remembering it was never going to be worn again. She couldn't explain it to anyone, not even herself. The grief wasn't loud. It didn't come in sobs or screams. It was quieter than that. Thicker. It lived in the pauses between heartbeats. In the space where joy used to be. At church, the pastor spoke about healing. About surrender. About trusting in things we can't understand. Evelyn sat in the back pew, hands folded, nodding when appropriate, but never speaking. Her faith hadn't left her. Not completely, but it had dimmed. Like a candle struggling against a breeze that wouldn't quit. Each August 3rd, the day they disappeared, she lit a single white candle in the front window. No words. No ceremony. Just the flame. The first year, a few neighbors stopped by. One brought tea. Another left wildflowers on the porch. By year 5, no one came. Only the candle remained. She wore her wedding band for 3 years. Then moved it to a chain around her neck. A quiet compromise between letting go and holding on. Money got tight after a while. David's life insurance never paid out. Too many uncertainties. No body. No conclusive evidence. The company labeled the case high risk, unresolved. Her appeal was denied. Twice. She sold the second car. Then the little fishing boat David had bought used and restored with Lily. The one they used on their trips. The one she couldn't bear to look at anymore. By the end of the 4th year, she was working nights cleaning office buildings to make ends meet. During the day, she counseled other people's children, little ones with scraped knees and broken homes, while carrying her own emptiness like a second spine. Friends tried to help at first, but over time, the invitations dwindled. People got uncomfortable. They didn't know how to sit with her silence. Evelyn couldn't blame them. Grief made her heavy to be around. And this wasn't normal grief. It didn't come with closure. There was no accident report. No final words. Just nothing. She wasn't a widow. Not officially. She wasn't a mother mourning a buried child. She was something in between. A woman whose story had been paused mid-sentence and left unfinished. One afternoon, around year 6, she got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just her name, scrawled in careful handwriting. Inside, a single page. From one of Lily's old friends. A girl named Marissa Caldwell. The letter was hesitant. Apologetic. Every word chosen like it might break something. We never knew how to say it, Marissa wrote. But there was always something strange about the way Lily looked at him. Like she didn't see him the way we did. It felt different. And we thought maybe we were just imagining it. But now, I'm not sure. Evelyn folded the letter once. Then again, she didn't throw it away. But she didn't respond either. Some truths arrived too late to be useful. And maybe she wasn't ready to face what they implied. She tried therapy once. Sat in a circle of women who had lost children to illness or accidents. They cried. They hugged. They talked about funerals, about the last words their kids had spoken. Evelyn didn't speak. Because her pain didn't have a shape. It wasn't something that could be held or named. It was an ache without a wound. A scream without sound. She went home that night and stared at Lily's closed door for a long time. Eventually, she opened it. Not to clean, not to pack, but to sit on the edge of her bed and whisper, "Where did you go?" She didn't expect an answer. But for the first time in years, she let herself ask. Because grieving someone who is gone is one thing. But grieving someone who might still be out there? That's a different kind of sorrow. It lingers. It waits. It never lets you rest. Evelyn wasn't grieving the dead. She was grieving the disappeared. And the silence they left behind was louder than any goodbye. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in late May. The kind of day that drifted by without purpose. The kind where the breeze through the open windows smelled like cut grass and distant ocean salt. Evelyn Monroe had just finished folding towels. She was reaching for her glass of iced tea when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in a while, Sandra Jacobs. Sandra had been her college roommate, now a retired nurse who spent half the year traveling. She sent postcards sometimes. Cheery updates from Portugal or Maine or somewhere else with pastel houses and open-air markets. Evelyn appreciated the effort, even if she rarely replied. This time, Sandra had sent a message. Just one sentence. "This festival is wild. You'd love it here." Attached was a video. No caption. No explanation. Evelyn tapped it open without thinking. The screen filled with color. Bright music. People dancing in a sun-drenched square somewhere warm. Children chasing bubbles. Women in red skirts spinning under paper lanterns. The kind of joy that almost looked staged. Almost too good to be real. She smiled a little. For a moment, it felt nice. To see something light. Then, around the 10th second, the camera tilted slightly to the right. And the world stopped. In the background, blurry but visible, a man and a woman were dancing. They weren't the focus of the video. Just caught in passing. But Evelyn's breath caught mid-chest. The man was older now. Shoulders broader. Hair grayer. A thick beard covering the jawline she once kissed. But the way he stood. The way he moved. The familiar rhythm in his hips and the way he held the woman close. It was David. And the woman beside him? She was no longer a 13-year-old girl in a hoodie. She was a young woman now. Late 20s maybe. Long brown hair. Graceful posture. The way she laughed. Head tilted slightly. Lips parted. It was Lily. Evelyn dropped the phone. It hit the counter with a dull clack. Her hand stayed frozen midair. She stared at the screen. At the moment paused. The two of them mid-turn, faces close. Smiling. Alive. She picked the phone back up. Watched the video again. This time slower. And again. Frame by frame. Her fingers trembled, but her face stayed still. No tears. No screams. Just a rising pressure in her chest that felt like it might snap her open from the inside out. 15 years. 15 years of lighting candles, of unanswered prayers, of holding her breath every time a body was found off the coast. 15 years of living inside a grief that now felt like a lie. They weren't dead. They had never been dead. They had left. She took screenshots, zoomed in until the pixels blurred. But even when the image dissolved into digital noise, the truth didn't. She knew her daughter. She knew the shape of David's shoulders. She knew. She whispered it to herself, like a confession. That's them. She sat at the kitchen table in silence for nearly an hour. The walls around her felt suddenly foreign. Like the house didn't belong to her anymore. Like the life she'd built had been carved from a falsehood. The rug pulled out, slow and cruel. She thought about the room she never changed. About the card Lily made for Father's Day. About the note in her journal. The one she hadn't dared read again. The sea listens better than people. It hadn't been poetry. It had been a warning. Evelyn stood and walked to the hallway closet. Pulled down the old shoebox where she kept the letters and mementos she hadn't been able to throw away. Inside was a folded note from Lily's friend Marissa, the one that had come 6 years too late. There was always something strange about the way she looked at him. Evelyn unfolded it slowly. Read the words again. Then again. A cold certainty settled into her bones. This hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a choice. David had taken Lily, and Lily had gone. The next morning, Evelyn bought a ticket. One way, Portland to Miami, then to Quito, then a bus to the coast. She didn't call Sandra. Didn't tell her she recognized the people in the video. She didn't say a word to her coworkers. Didn't tell the woman who brought her groceries on Thursdays. Didn't even call her sister. She packed light. For changes of clothes. A travel-sized toothbrush. A worn paperback for the flight that she knew she wouldn't read. And a single printout of the blurry screenshot, folded neatly into her wallet. She left her porch light on, just like always. But this time, she didn't plan to come back the same. The flight was long. The kind of long that rearranges your bones. But Evelyn barely noticed. Her mind had already left her body. At the terminal in Quito, she kept her head down. The smells of roasted corn and diesel fuel mixed thick in the air. She found the bus station. Bought a ticket south. No questions. No hesitation. The bus wound its way through mountains and valleys, past painted churches and flocks of goats. Vendors came aboard selling boiled eggs in plastic bags. A child slept on his mother's lap across the aisle. Evelyn just watched the road unravel. She arrived at the coast just after sunset. The town was small, quieter than she expected. Hammocks on porches. Stray dogs curled beneath fruit stands. The kind of place where people vanish to, not from. She paid for a room in a low building with peeling white paint and rusted window screens. No one asked for ID. No one cared about her name. She slept with one hand on her bag and the other on her chest, trying to keep her heart from breaking all over again. In the morning, she walked, following landmarks from the video. The bakery with blue shutters. The red lantern strung between buildings. The corner where the man sold fried plantains. It took her 2 days, but she found it. A modest yellow house with a wooden gate and 2 hammocks swinging in the breeze. She didn't approach. She didn't knock. She just stood across the street and watched. They came out together. David now went by Daniel. Lily by Clara. Everyone in town knew them. Polite, private, quiet. The kind of couple who smiled but never invited anyone too close. No one suspected anything. Why would they? They looked happy. They looked ordinary. But Evelyn saw what others didn't. The way Lily leaned into David's shoulder. The way he reached for her waist like it belonged to him. The way they laughed. Heads tilted close, as if the world couldn't touch them. She watched for days. Mapped their routines. Morning market. Afternoon walks. Dinner by the beach. She never looked away. And with each passing moment, the truth hardened. They hadn't been taken. They had left. Together. And they had never once looked back. Evelyn Monroe never thought she'd find herself walking unfamiliar streets in a foreign country, chasing ghosts. But there she was, in a quiet coastal village in Ecuador, dressed in linen pants and an oversized sun hat. Her shoes coated in dust from the cobbled roads. Her heart beating with a clarity she hadn't felt in 15 years. She wasn't there for closure. She wasn't there to forgive. She was there for truth. Every morning, she left her small motel room just after sunrise. The fan buzzed overhead, stirring the humid air, but she barely noticed it anymore. She moved with purpose. Quiet, steady, alert. A woman with a mission. She carried a notebook in her tote bag. Plain brown cover. Nothing written on the outside. Inside, her handwriting had taken on a sharp, angular rhythm. Dates, times, places, movements. David and Lily, now Daniel and Clara, lived in a modest yellow house on a corner street lined with palms. There was a crooked wooden gate out front and 2 hammocks on the porch that swayed even when the air was still. Evelyn never got too close. Instead, she sat at a cafe down the street, ordered black coffee she barely drank, and watched. They followed a routine. That was the first thing she noticed. Mornings, they walked to the open market. They greeted the same vendors, bought the same produce. Tomatoes, onions, a bundle of cilantro. Always in cash. Always with soft smiles and short conversations. Afternoons, Lily, Clara, taught English lessons to neighborhood children under a shaded patio behind a small cafe. She was good at it. Confident. Graceful. The kind of teacher who made kids lean forward and listen. She laughed often, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. David, or Daniel as he was now known, helped out at the docks. Nothing official. He fixed broken motors and helped load supply boats. Sometimes he sat for hours by the shoreline, mending nets with the local fishermen, his ball cap turned backward just like it had been back home. They fit in just enough to not be noticed. But Evelyn noticed everything. She saw the way Lily watched David when she thought no one else was looking. Not like a daughter looks at a father, but like a woman watches the man who holds her whole world. There was intimacy in their silence, familiarity in their gestures, a rhythm too rehearsed to be innocent. At first, Evelyn hoped she was wrong. That grief and rage had blurred her judgment. That maybe, just maybe, there was another explanation. But on the 4th day, she saw something that removed all doubt. They were walking along the beach, hand in hand. The late sun cast long shadows behind them. Lily's skirt fluttered in the breeze. David leaned in, said something that made her laugh. She stopped, turned toward him, and kissed him softly on the mouth. Not on the cheek. Not the quick, awkward peck of a shared past. But on the mouth. Slow. Familiar. And when they pulled apart, she rested her head against his chest like she belonged there. Evelyn felt her breath catch. Not in shock anymore, but in a realization that cut deep and final. They weren't just living. They were living as if she had never existed. She sat on a stone wall near the beach for a long time after that, watching the waves, listening to the distant hum of a guitar from a bar down the street, trying to understand how a man could steal a child's life and convince her it was love. She opened her notebook and wrote. They didn't vanish. They transformed. Later that evening, she returned to her motel room, pulled the curtains shut, and laid all the pieces out in her mind. The long boat rides, the missed phone calls, the way Lily started locking her door, the quiet distance that grew between them like a vine creeping up the wall, and that line in Lily's journal. The ocean listens better than people. It hadn't been a metaphor. It had been a map. Evelyn knew she couldn't go to the authorities. Not here. Not without proof of something more than betrayal. What would she say? That her missing husband and daughter had faked their deaths to run off together? She needed more. She needed to be certain. So she watched. Each day, she tracked their steps, drew a crude map in her notebook, labeled buildings, marked patterns, noticed where they lingered and where they avoided, how long they spent at the market, when they returned home, who they spoke to. She noted when Lily wore rings and when she didn't. She documented when they kissed in public and when they kept their distance. It was all there. A twisted domestic routine. 2 people who had rewritten their story with new names and new smiles, but the same secret beneath the surface. Evelyn never cried. Not once. She had done all her crying years ago. This wasn't grief anymore. This was clarity. They hadn't drowned. They hadn't been taken. They had chosen. And they had left her behind to carry the weight. To carry the shame. To live inside a lie while they danced under foreign stars. By the end of her 7th day in town, Evelyn knew their schedule by heart. She knew they walked the same path to the bakery every Thursday morning. She knew Lily preferred the green papayas over the ripe ones. She knew David always counted exact change, even when it meant holding up the line. They were creatures of habit, but they were also arrogant. They believed they were safe, that they had buried the past deep enough it couldn't claw its way back. But Evelyn had found them. She had followed the whispers. She had stood in the wreckage and traced the outline of a truth too awful to imagine. Now, it was time to decide what to do with it. Late that night, She sat on the edge of her motel bed, bare feet touching the cool tile floor. The air was thick. The ceiling fan wobbled with a soft creak. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out the folded screenshot, and laid it flat beside her. Then she picked up her notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. Not with trembling hands, not with fury, but with resolve. They built a new life on top of my grave. And then, I didn't come here for answers. I came to witness, to look them in the eye, and make them see what they buried. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and waited for morning. It happened on a Wednesday. The sun was beginning to dip low over the rooftops, casting long shadows through the narrow streets of the coastal village. The smell of grilled plantains and salt water drifted on the breeze. A few children kicked a flat soccer ball down the alley. A vendor rinsed dishes behind his cart, and Evelyn Monroe stood across from the yellow house, pressed into a patch of fading shade, waiting. She had been there for nearly an hour, her back against the wall, her hands inside her tote bag, fingertips resting on the grip of the pistol she had purchased 2 nights before. It was wrapped in a cloth, tucked beneath her notebook and wallet, light enough to carry, heavy enough to change everything. She had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this moment in her mind. Some started with questions, others ended with screaming. But when the door finally opened, and they stepped into view, everything else fell away. There they were, David and Lily. Only now they were Daniel and Clara, smiling, carrying 2 small grocery bags. David wore the same backwards ball cap he had worn when he used to mow the lawn on Saturday mornings back in Oregon. Lily wore a cotton dress, sandals, her hair pulled into a bun, a woven bracelet around her wrist that looked handmade. They were laughing, moving slowly, at peace. And that, more than anything, set something loose inside Evelyn's chest. They didn't see her at first, not until she stepped out from the shadows. 6 feet. That's how close she let herself get. Close enough to see the small scar above David's eyebrow, the one he got from fixing the garage door years ago. Close enough to see the dimple in Lily's cheek that only showed when she laughed, wide and unguarded. Lily saw her first. She stopped. The plastic bag in her hand swung gently against her leg. Her mouth parted. Her eyes went wide. "Mom." David turned, and for the first time in 15 years, their eyes met. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Evelyn's voice was steady. "Lo, so it's true," she said. "You didn't drown. You didn't die. You just left." David took a small step forward, one hand raised slightly. Not in defense, not in fear, just caution. "Evelyn, don't," she cut him off. "Don't you dare say my name like you still have the right." Lily's voice cracked. "We didn't mean to hurt you." Evelyn turned to her. "You didn't mean to hurt me," she repeated. "You let me bury you. You let me light candles for ghosts while you danced under the stars with him." David's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth again, but Evelyn raised her hand. Not with the gun, just her palm. "A warning. I lived inside that house for 15 years, she said. "With your shoes by the door. With your drawings still on the fridge. I kept your room exactly the same. I waited for answers that never came." Lily's eyes welled. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was," Evelyn said. Her voice never rose, but the words landed like stones. "Because I saw the way you looked at him. I saw how you clung to him even back then. I thought it was fatherly. I thought it was safe." David spoke now. "You don't understand what we went through." Evelyn's laugh was hollow, sharp. "You took her, David. You took a child and made her yours in a way no man ever should." He started to protest. "It wasn't." "Don't lie to me," she snapped. For a split second, the street fell into silence. Even the children had stopped playing. Evelyn reached into her bag. David stiffened. She pulled out the gun, held it low, not raised, not aimed, just visible. "I'm not here to beg," she said. "I'm not here for closure. I just wanted to see your faces, to hear you admit it." Lily stepped forward, voice trembling. "Mom, please. It's not what you think." Evelyn looked at her, and in that look, there was pain so old it no longer bled. "You were 13, she said. "You wore pigtails and read fantasy books and talked in your sleep. And somehow, he made you believe this." She gestured between them, was love. Tears ran down Lily's cheeks. David took another step, voice firmer now. "You need to calm down." Evelyn's gaze snapped to him. "I needed a lot of things, David. I needed you to come home. I needed a goodbye. I needed my daughter to stay a child just a little longer." He opened his mouth again, and that's when Evelyn raised the gun. David lunged. A single shot rang out. He dropped hard. The groceries spilled. The bag of limes rolled across the cobblestone. Lily screamed. Not a scream of surprise, but of something deeper, something primal. She dropped to her knees beside him. No, 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 she cried. Please. Evelyn stepped forward. Her face was wet now, but she hadn't realized she was crying. You already buried me once, she whispered. Then she pulled the trigger again. The silence that followed was instant. Final. A woman screamed from a nearby balcony. A door slammed. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then went silent. Lily lay curled beside David's body. Blood pooled beneath them. Two figures entwined in a death that mirrored the life they had chosen. Evelyn stood over them. For the first time in years, her hands didn't shake. She looked up at the darkening sky, then down at what was left of her family. She placed the gun gently on the sidewalk and waited. When the police arrived minutes later, she didn't move. She didn't speak. She raised her hands slowly, like a woman who had just finished something she was meant to do. And when they asked her name, she said only, "I'm the mother." The arrest didn't feel dramatic. There were no flashing lights, no shouted orders, no guns drawn. When the local officers arrived, they moved slowly, cautiously. A few neighbors had already gathered, their faces pale with shock, peeking from behind doors and leaning over balconies. The yellow house sat still behind Evelyn, its front porch light flickering as if unsure whether to stay on. David and Lily lay side by side on the street. Grocery bags spilled, a trail of blood stretching toward the gutter. Evelyn didn't run. She didn't flinch. She simply stood with her palms raised and her eyes steady, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. One of the officers approached, hand resting on his weapon, voice low and firm. "Senora, por favor." She didn't speak at first, just nodded. Then slowly, she crouched and placed the pistol gently on the sidewalk. Another officer moved in and secured it. They patted her down, cuffed her wrists behind her back. "Read her rights in Spanish." She nodded again. When they asked for her name, she answered clearly. "Evelyn Grace Monroe. I'm the mother." They led her to the back of a small patrol truck. No sirens. No hurry. Just a quiet drive through the winding village roads as the sun slipped behind the hills. At the precinct, she was processed like anyone else. Mugshot. Fingerprints. Clothes cataloged. The woman behind the desk didn't look her in the eyes. She was given a plain jumpsuit. The fabric was stiff. The shoes didn't fit. Her wedding ring, still worn on a chain around her neck, was removed and placed in a plastic bag labeled evidence. They offered her a blanket. She didn't take it. In the holding cell, Evelyn sat on the edge of a metal cot. The walls were bare, the window too high to see out of. She didn't sleep. She didn't ask for water. She just sat, as if the weight of everything that had happened had finally settled. Not crushing, but complete. When the officer brought her breakfast the next morning, a piece of bread and a small plastic cup of coffee, she thanked him. Her voice was soft, still warm. A few hours later, she asked to speak with someone in charge. "I'm ready to give my statement," she said. No lawyer. No hesitation. They brought her to a gray room with peeling paint and a flickering light overhead. The ceiling fan made a soft, unsteady whir. Evelyn sat upright, hands folded on the table. When the officer pressed record and asked her to begin, she didn't pause. "My name is Evelyn Grace Monroe. I'm 61 years old. I was born in Tillamook, Oregon. I'm a widow. I was a mother." Her voice didn't crack. She didn't stumble. She told them everything. How her husband and daughter vanished in 2007. How she grieved. How she waited. How she lit candles in a window for ghosts who were never dead. How she received a video 15 years later. How she recognized them. How she followed them. How she watched them live a life that was never supposed to exist. She described the house, the routines, the laughter, the way Lily, Clara, looked at David, the way David touched her in public without shame. "They didn't just run," she said. "They built something on top of my grave." She paused, then leaned forward. "And I didn't shoot strangers. I shot the ghosts that haunted me. I shot the betrayal." The officer scribbled notes, never interrupting. "I know what I did," Evelyn said. "It was murder, but it was also the only way I knew how to make it stop." She signed the bottom of the report without flinching. When they asked if she had anything else to add, she looked them straight in the eye. No one should be left to grieve a lie. That kind of grief never ends. It eats you alive. Back in her cell, She slept for the first time in 4 nights. Not deeply, but fully. News of the shooting made its way home within days. Local papers in Oregon picked it up first, then the national outlets. Missing family found in Ecuador, murdered by grieving wife. The headlines told only a fraction of the story. Some called it a tragedy. Others called it justice. The comments online were split between outrage and sympathy. How could she do that? I would have done the same thing. What kind of father does that to his daughter? What kind of mother pulls the trigger? But Evelyn never read any of it. She was transferred to a regional detention facility, where she waited for the paperwork to be sorted. Her cell was small, but clean. The guard on duty said she was the quietest inmate they'd ever had. She didn't make phone calls, didn't ask for visitors. She wrote letters, but never sent them. She kept a small notebook on her nightstand, the same one she used in Ecuador. The pages filled slowly. Short sentences, thoughts she had never said aloud. They looked happy. He still wore the same cologne. She didn't flinch when he kissed her. I wasn't crazy. I just knew. She never once said she regretted it. Not to the guards. Not to the officials. Not even in her journal. The closest she came was a single sentence written late one night. If they had looked me in the eye and said sorry, would I have pulled the trigger anyway? She never answered the question. Didn't have to. Because the truth wasn't just in what she had done. It was in what she had lived through. 15 years of silence. 15 years of waiting. 15 years of mourning people who were still breathing. When the consulate asked if she wanted legal representation from back home, she declined. "I'll take whatever punishment you see fit," she said. "Just don't call me crazy." I knew what I was doing. There's a kind of justice that doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with courtroom cheers or headlines that feel satisfying. Sometimes justice is quiet. Sometimes it shows up late. And sometimes, it looks like a woman sitting alone in a jail cell, finally breathing without the weight of lies on her chest. Evelyn didn't smile, didn't weep. She just sat, steady, unmoving. And for the first time in years, she was no longer waiting. Because the truth had finally arrived. And she had met it head on. The trial began on a warm September morning. The courtroom was small. No cameras. No live broadcasts. Just rows of wooden benches, a single overhead fan, and the sound of a community holding its breath. Evelyn Monroe entered in a gray jumpsuit, her wrists cuffed gently in front of her. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose knot. She didn't look at the people in the gallery, didn't search for familiar faces. Her eyes were fixed forward. To some, she looked like a criminal. To others, she looked like a woman who had already served her sentence long before she ever stood in front of a judge. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. They showed the surveillance footage from the street, the moment Evelyn stepped from the shadows, the moment she raised the gun, the way both victims fell. They described her journey from Oregon to Ecuador. They detailed the purchase of the pistol, the handwritten confession left in the motel room. They called her methodical, premeditated, dangerous, a woman consumed by grief who had turned it into vengeance. They painted Evelyn as someone who had waited 15 years not for justice, but for revenge. And when they spoke about Lily, about Clara, they referred to her as a victim of trauma, someone manipulated, someone misled, someone who had lived in a twisted world of control, and still didn't deserve to die. The courtroom sat in silence as they read Evelyn's own words from her statement. "I didn't kill strangers. I killed the ghosts that haunted me." Then came the defense. They didn't argue the facts. Evelyn had never denied pulling the trigger. What they focused on was everything that came before. They told the jury about the disappearance, about the boat that drifted back without a scratch, about the house Evelyn kept untouched, the birthdays spent alone, the years of unanswered questions. They spoke about betrayal, about silence, about the kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral but still manages to bury you alive. They called a psychiatrist to the stand. He wasn't flashy. He didn't dramatize. He simply said, Evelyn Monroe lived in suspended agony for 15 years. What she experienced wasn't just loss. It was erasure. She didn't snap. She unraveled. Quietly. Over time. The jury listened. 12 strangers who had never lived through what Evelyn had endured. But maybe they knew something about heartbreak. About unanswered prayers. About watching someone you love become someone else. Evelyn never took the stand. She didn't want to speak, not because she was afraid, but because she believed she had already said all she needed to say. Her words were in the journal, in the statement, In the silence, she had carried like a second skin. When the time came, the jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty. 2 counts of second-degree murder. Not first-degree. Not life without parole. They recognized something in her story. Not justification, but understanding. The sentence was 30 years in prison. Possibility of parole after 20. Evelyn didn't cry when she heard the decision. She stood still, shoulders back, chin lifted. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she nodded once and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't defeat. It was relief. Because for the first time since that morning on the porch, 15 years ago, there were no more questions. No more what-ifs. No more shadows to chase. No more waiting for the dead to come home. She had found them, and she had brought the silence to an end. After the trial, the house in Ecuador was sealed by local authorities. No one came to claim the bodies. No family. No embassy. No funeral. Just 2 names on a death certificate, and a house left behind with dishes still in the sink and clothes folded in drawers. Locals lit candles on the porch for a few days. But eventually, even that faded. Life moved on. Back in the U.S., Evelyn was transferred to a women's correctional facility in Washington state. Medium security. Clean. Quiet. She kept mostly to herself. Didn't cause trouble. Didn't seek company. She spent her mornings in the prison library, reading old classics and watching the sun move across the walls. She took up gardening duty. Watered the plants like they were something sacred. Something alive that would never leave. Other women asked her what she was in for. Sometimes she told them. Sometimes she didn't. The guard said she was polite. Grateful. The kind of inmate who followed the rules without being asked. One night, a younger inmate sat beside her during dinner. Asked if it was true that she'd tracked her family halfway around the world. That she'd watched them for days before finally confronting them. Evelyn paused, then said softly, "Yes, it's true." The girl asked why, and Evelyn answered, without blinking, "Because they made a choice. And so did I." She didn't explain further. Didn't need to. Not everyone would understand. But some did. In her cell, she kept a journal. Not like the old one. This one was smaller, neater, more peaceful. She wrote about memories. Not the ones that broke her, but the ones she chose to keep. Lily in her pajamas, giggling at cartoons. David fixing the fence with a nail between his teeth. Sunday mornings. French toast. Wind chimes. The parts that hadn't lied to her. The parts that were real. The parts she could still hold on to. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she lit a battery-powered candle and placed it near the small window of her cell. She didn't say a prayer. Didn't speak their names. She just sat with the silence. Not because it haunted her anymore, but because it had finally stopped growing. And in that stillness, she found something close to peace. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it walks into a courtroom in a gray jumpsuit and says, "Thank you," when the sentence is read. Not because she was guilty of loving too much, but because she had survived what no one should ever have to. And when the time came, when it was finally her turn to speak, she didn't beg. She didn't break. She told the truth. And then she let the silence fall exactly where it belonged.